All right, guys, so we're going to take a look at how to create a histogram. We're going to start with this question right here. And it says, Leo surveyed the students to see how many hours children were spending on their electronic media on the weekends. So this is the data he collected, and it's just got a data set of tables, and it says these were the hours that students had spent on electronic media. So anytime that we're going to create a histogram to represent the data, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is what is the spread or what is the range of the data, because that's how we're going to set up our intervals. So when I'm looking at this data set, the first thing I need to know is what was the minimum amount of time spent on electronic media. Our minimum amount of time spent was 0 hours. And then I need to know what was the maximum amount of time spent on electronic media. That's the most. And we've got that 21 was our maximum. So we have a spread or a range from 0 to 21. Okay, so the next thing after we figure that out, what we're going to do is we're going to create a frequency table, and we need to figure out what would be a good interval or a good skip count that we could use to represent this data. Okay, so if we're going all the way from 0 to 21, okay, there's lots of different skip counts that we could use, but I'm thinking that 5s would be the easiest to go about this. So, and actually, if you look at the answer choices on question number 1, they're counting by 5s, so that gives us a hint that our intervals should be broken up into 5s. Okay, so on our frequency table, over here on the left is where we're going to put our intervals, and over here on the right is where we're going to put our tally marks for the frequency. So, our first interval that we're going to set up, and if you don't have this on your paper, you need to be putting it on now, is our 0 to 4. Now, we said that 5 was our width, and if you count 0, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. That's actually 5 spaces wide, okay? So then our next interval would go to the very next number, it would be 5, and if we count, we would have 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. That gives us a width of 5, okay? Then we keep going. We have 10 to 14, 15 to 19, and 20 to 24, okay? So those are our intervals, and like I said, we're going to come over here and we're going to put in our tally marks. So if we look at 12, we have to figure out which range it falls into, and it falls between 10 and 14, so I'm going to put 1 tally mark. 3 falls into our 0 to 4 interval. 5 falls into our 5 to 9 interval. 9 falls into our 5 to 9 interval. 11 falls into our 10 to 14 interval. 21 falls into the 20 to 24 interval. 18 is the 15 to 19. 2 is our 0 to 4. 0, also 0 to 4. 11 goes in our 10 to 14 interval. 9 goes into our 5 to 9. 2 is our 0 to 4. Then I'm going to go back up to the top here. 4 goes into our 0 to 4, but I already have 4 tally marks there, so remember, it makes a bundle. That's our 5th one. So now we have 5 over here. Oops, sorry. Then we have 8, and that falls into our 5 to 9. Our 10 falls into our 10 to 14. Then we have a 0, so since I have a bundle of 5, I'm going to come over here and put a 1. Then I have a 7, which makes our 5th one here, so it's a cross, it's a bundle. And then we have a 19, so that falls in our 15 to 19. Okay, so this is our frequency table, and that tells us how frequent these intervals appeared. Okay, all right, so now that we've made our frequency table, we're ready to actually use our frequency table to actually make our histogram. And remember, we talked about using graph paper so we could keep everything all nice and lined up. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do when we're actually making the display is to draw our X and Y axis. Okay, that's our horizontal and that's our vertical axis. Okay, after we draw those, we need to label those. Okay, on your X-axis, down here on your X-axis, you're going to put your interval width. Okay, we said that we were skip counting by 5s. So down here, each line is going to represent, we're going to skip count by 5s. So our first line is a 5. Okay, then we get a 10, 15, 20, and our 25. Now be sure that you're labeling the lines and not the spaces, because the spaces, this is 0 to 5. Okay, so that's where our bars are going to go. So you need to be labeling the lines. Okay. After you label your x-axis, you're going to go label your y-axis, which is the vertical one that's up and down, and it represents our frequencies. And our frequencies we did over here, we can see that our largest frequency was a 6, our smallest frequency was a 1. Okay, so if we're going from 1 to 6, those are pretty small numbers, so we can just label those by 1s. And again, we're labeling the lines, okay, 1, 2, 3, not the spaces, okay. After we put the numbers down, we need to tell people what those numbers represent. Down here, our intervals are talking about time in hours, okay. Our frequency, or how often it occurred, we can just call that the frequency. Okay. All right, so now we're actually going to go and draw a bar to represent how often these intervals occurred. All right, so if we look from 0 to 4, that's going to be our space that is more than 0 but less than 5. It occurred 6 times, so I'm going to draw a bar up to 6. Okay. Now we're going to go to our next interval. We have 5 to 9, and it occurred 5 times. So it's more than 5, but less than 10. And so I'm going to draw my bar up to that 5th marker right there. Let's look at our next interval. We have 10 to 14, so more than 10, but less than 15. And that occurred 4 times. So I'm going to draw my bar up to the 4th line. Then we're going to take a look at 15 to 19, more than 15, but less than 20. And it occurred 2 times, so we're going to draw our bar up to the 2. And then our last one is 20 to 24, more than 20, but less than 25. And it only occurred 1 time, so I'm going to draw my bar up to the 1. Okay, so now we have our frequency chart, and it is displayed on our histogram. The last thing that we need to do is we need to put a title on our histogram to tell people what this graph represents. Okay, and this graph, if we looked back, was Leo, and he was surveying time spent on electronic media. So I'm just going to give it a title, Time Spent on Electronics. Okay, so that's what you're going to do. Take a look at number 2. Gives you a very similar situation where you have a set of data. You need to first find the range or the spread. You need to make a frequency table, and then you actually need to create your histogram.